Jamal's morning began like any other. The soft hum of traffic filtered in through the cracked window of his small bedroom, mixing with the muffled sounds of a busy street below. His room was modest, just a twin bed, a cluttered desk where he had spent late nights solving algebra problems, and posters of famous athletes tacked to the walls. But Jamal didn't mind. What it lacked in luxury, it made up for in warmth. Here, in this crowded apartment, he found security and routine. He was 14, full of dreams far bigger than his surroundings. Despite living in a neighborhood weighed down by the challenges of poverty and neglect, Jamal carried himself with quiet pride. He wasn't the type to make excuses. If life gave him obstacles, he found ways to climb over them, determined to one day leave his mark on the world. He often told himself, "One day, I'll be a doctor." That dream was rooted not in fantasy, but in long afternoons volunteering at a local clinic. It was in those moments, bandaging small cuts, fetching medicine from the supply closet, that Jamal felt he belonged to something greater than himself. Jamal's mother, Lisa, was the rock of his life. She worked tirelessly at the hospital, covering double shifts to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. She had taught Jamal the value of kindness, not just through words, but through the small acts she performed daily, making sandwiches for the elderly neighbor, leaving spare change in donation jars. "Kindness isn't easy," she would tell Jamal, "especially when the world doesn't show it back. But it's always worth it." This lesson weighed on Jamal some mornings more than others. Living as a young black boy in a city where prejudice clung to the air like humidity made it difficult to believe in kindness all the time. He'd seen it in the side-eye glances from shopkeepers and felt it in the way security guards lingered when he wandered through nicer parts of town. Yet Jamal carried his mother's words with him like armor, hoping that they might someday change something, if not the world, then at least himself. As he sat down at the kitchen table for breakfast, the familiar smell of toast and eggs filled the small space. His mother's voice, gentle but firm, floated from the stove. "Eat up. You've got a long day ahead of you." He nodded, stuffing his schoolbooks into his backpack as he ate. The world outside the apartment was loud and chaotic. Graffiti-covered walls and cracked sidewalks framed streets lined with struggling businesses. But to Jamal, it was home. He knew every alley and shortcut by heart. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was familiar, and the people here, his people, felt like family. On the other side of town, Walter Collins stirred awake in his quiet, empty house. His life was the mirror opposite of Jamal's, cold, isolated, and meticulously controlled. The house was well maintained, with a lawn that was always trimmed to perfection, not because Walter took pride in it, but because he hated change. His morning began the way it always did, with black coffee in a chipped mug and the morning paper spread across the table. Walter was a man burdened by bitterness, though he wouldn't have admitted it. He lived alone now, ever since his wife passed away 5 years earlier. His 2 children, both grown, rarely visited, and the silence in the house had long ago become suffocating. It gnawed at him in ways he couldn't articulate, though his response to that loneliness had been to bury it beneath layers of resentment. Resentment toward the world, toward progress, and especially toward people who didn't look like him. He had lived in the same neighborhood for over 3 decades, a place that had once been a sanctuary of comfort. But over the years, things had changed. New faces had moved in, and with them came a discomfort Walter couldn't ignore. He viewed the arrival of immigrants and minorities as a threat, though he rarely spoke those thoughts aloud. His contempt seeped out in other ways: cold glances, muttered remarks, the occasional grumble about how things used to be better. This morning, like every other, he leashed his old Labrador, Buddy, and headed out for his walk. The crisp morning air was one of the few things Walter still enjoyed. It was a chance to escape the house, even if only for a little while. The walk was routine, down the street, around the park, and back home again. He never deviated from this path. It was familiar, predictable, safe. As Jamal pedaled his bike toward school that morning, he crossed into unfamiliar territory. The shortcut through the wealthier part of town made the ride faster, but it also came with a silent understanding. He wasn't exactly welcome here. He felt the tension in the air, the way it stiffened when he passed through these streets. He kept his head down, pedaling quickly, trying not to draw attention. Walter noticed him almost immediately. His eyes narrowed as the boy on the bike glided past, his dark skin and confident posture standing out like a beacon. Walter muttered to himself, a grumble that was more habit than thought. "What are they doing here?" The question was sharp, bitter. He tugged Buddy's leash a little tighter, as if the dog might sense his irritation. Jamal caught the look on Walter's face, a scowl filled with quiet contempt. And for a moment, the two worlds collided in silence. It was the kind of encounter Jamal was used to, a passing exchange that left him feeling invisible and unwelcome all at once. He knew better than to stop, though. Instead, he whispered to himself, "Let it go." His mother's words echoed in his mind. Not everyone would treat him with kindness, but that didn't mean he couldn't choose to be kind in return. Walter watched Jamal ride away, his scowl deepening. He muttered under his breath as he continued his walk, the boy's presence lingering like an unwanted stain in his morning routine. To Walter, Jamal was just another reminder that the world was changing in ways he didn't like. Neither of them could have known that, in just a few hours, their lives would intersect again. But this time, in a way that neither would forget. The sun hung low in the sky by the time Jamal reached the far edge of the park, its soft light filtering through the branches of oak trees that lined the street. It was a peaceful morning, the kind of calm that hinted at spring's arrival. But even as Jamal pedaled along, the serenity felt like a thin layer, one that could be disrupted at any moment. He didn't usually take this route. There was always the risk of crossing paths with someone who made it clear that kids like him didn't belong. But today the breeze was too nice, and the shortcut shaved several minutes off his commute. So he rode through the neighborhood quickly, hoping to avoid lingering stares or trouble. Walter Collins was also out, just a few streets away, walking Buddy along their usual path. The dog trotted happily at his side, tail wagging, unaware of the tension his owner carried. Walter moved slowly, shoulders hunched, grumbling as he passed the blooming flower beds and perfect lawns that lined his street. He didn't feel joy in his surroundings the way others might. Instead, he saw the world through a lens of bitterness and nostalgia. A world that, in his view, was no longer what it should be. Walter hated leaving his house too often. It wasn't the outside world that scared him exactly. It was the people in it. He felt disconnected from everyone, as though life had passed him by, leaving him behind with nothing but resentment and regret. Most mornings the only conversations he had were with Buddy, and even those were one-sided. As he shuffled down the street, something shifted in his chest, a sharp, sudden pressure that radiated through his arm. Walter stopped in his tracks, clutching at his ribcage. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt thick and heavy, as though someone had stuffed cotton into his lungs. The realization hit him like a blow. He was having a heart attack. Walter staggered, trying to steady himself against a nearby fence. Buddy barked in alarm, pulling on his leash as his owner collapsed onto the sidewalk. The pain in Walter's chest grew unbearable, spreading down his left arm and into his jaw. He gasped for air, but it came in short, desperate bursts. His vision blurred, and the world around him tilted dangerously. He lay there, helpless, as the street spun around him. Panic settled into his bones, but with it came a cold, sinking certainty. No one was coming to help. And then, out of nowhere, the faint sound of a bike's tires rolling over pavement broke through the haze. Jamal saw him before he understood what was happening. At first it looked like the old man had simply fallen, maybe tripped over his dog's leash or lost his balance. But as he got closer, he noticed the way the man's body twisted in pain, the desperate way he clutched his chest. Without hesitation, Jamal skidded his bike to a stop. His heart pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to focus. He had seen this before, at the clinic, during a first aid course. It was a heart attack. For a brief second, Jamal hesitated. He recognized the man. It was the same man who had scowled at him earlier, the same man whose eyes had burned with quiet hostility, as if Jamal's very existence was an insult. Jamal could hear his own thoughts, fast and loud. What if he doesn't want my help? What if he gets mad? But then his mother's voice came to him, as clear as if she were standing right beside him. Kindness isn't about who deserves it. Jamal dropped his bike and knelt beside Walter. Hey, can you hear me?" he called, shaking the man's shoulder gently. Walter's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with pain. He mumbled something incoherent, his face pale and slick with sweat. Jamal's heart raced, but he didn't allow himself to panic. He checked Walter's pulse, weak but still there, and pulled out his phone to dial 911. 911, what's your emergency? There's an old man, he's having a heart attack, Jamal blurted, his voice breathless but steady. He gave the dispatcher the address, glancing down at Walter, who was slipping in and out of consciousness. The dispatcher's voice was calm. "Stay with him. Help is on the way. Does he have any medication with him?" Jamal glanced around quickly, searching the man's pockets. In one of them he found a small bottle of nitroglycerin pills. He fumbled with the cap, managing to shake one into his palm. "Okay, sir, I'm going to give you this," Jamal murmured, carefully placing the pill under Walter's tongue. His hands trembled, but he kept going. "Just hold on, okay? They're coming. You'll be okay." Walter groaned softly, his lips moving as if trying to form words. Jamal leaned closer, catching faint fragments. "Why, you?" Jamal knew what the man was asking. Why was he helping? But there wasn't time to answer. Not now. Not in this moment where every second counted. The wail of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Jamal stayed by Walter's side, talking softly to him, even though he wasn't sure if the man could hear him. He kept a hand on the man's shoulder, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. When the paramedics arrived, they moved quickly, assessing Walter's condition and loading him onto a stretcher. One of them turned to Jamal, nodding in appreciation. "You did good, kid. You probably saved his life." Jamal watched as they loaded Walter into the ambulance. The doors slammed shut, and the vehicle sped away, leaving Jamal standing alone on the sidewalk with Buddy, the old dog whining softly beside him. The weight of what had just happened settled over him slowly. He had saved the life of a man who had looked at him with nothing but contempt, and yet, as Jamal stood there catching his breath, he felt no regret. His mother had been right. Kindness wasn't about who deserved it. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. He gave Buddy a pat on the head and whispered, "He's gonna be okay." Then he climbed back onto his bike, the wheels turning beneath him as he pedaled toward school, leaving behind the quiet street and the life he had just saved. But Jamal couldn't have known that this act of kindness, the choice to help when it would have been easier to walk away, was only the beginning. What came next would be unlike anything he could have imagined. Walter drifted in and out of consciousness as the ambulance sped toward the hospital, the sounds of medical equipment beeping and the murmur of paramedics filtering dimly through his mind. Pain throbbed in his chest, but beneath it was another feeling, a strange, nagging discomfort that had nothing to do with his heart. In the fog of his fading awareness, he kept seeing the boy's face. Jamal's concerned expression hovered just beyond reach, haunting him as the ambulance lights flashed overhead. Walter couldn't fully comprehend what had happened. He had been lying there, helpless, certain that no one would come. And yet, it wasn't some neighbor or friend who'd saved him. It was that boy, the one he had dismissed without a second thought. That single, confusing truth swirled around his mind, pressing down on him harder than the heart attack itself. When Walter finally awoke in the sterile quiet of the hospital, his body ached with exhaustion. The room was dim, save for the faint glow of machines that beeped steadily at his bedside. His chest felt tight, the weight of the ordeal lingering like a heavy fog. As he shifted painfully in the bed, the nurse entered, checking his vitals. Walter barely acknowledged her, too wrapped up in the whirlwind of emotions and confusion swirling in his mind. A soft knock at the door followed moments later, and to his disbelief, Jamal stood hesitantly in the doorway. The boy looked smaller under the hospital's fluorescent lights. his usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. Jamal had ridden his bike straight from school, heart still pounding from the adrenaline of the morning's events. He hadn't told his mother yet, he wasn't even sure why he came, but part of him hoped that maybe, just maybe, the man he'd helped would be grateful. Maybe the old man would look at him with something other than contempt. For a moment, the two stared at each other across the small hospital room, caught in the awkward silence of unspoken emotions. Walter blinked, his lips twitching slightly as if searching for the right words. But gratitude didn't come easily to him. The walls he had built around himself were too thick, too fortified by years of bitterness. "Why are you here?" Walter's voice was hoarse, the question more blunt than he intended. Jamal swallowed, feeling the sting of the words. He had imagined a different response, maybe not a thank you, but at least some kind of acknowledgement. Instead, the old man's tone was cold, distant, as if Jamal's presence was more of a nuisance than anything else. "I just wanted to see if you were okay," Jamal mumbled, shifting awkwardly in the doorway. His hands clenched the straps of his backpack, trying to mask the disappointment tightening in his chest. Walter looked away, uncomfortable under the boy's gaze. A knot of conflicting emotions churned inside him: anger, shame, confusion. He couldn't understand why Jamal had saved him, and the realization made him feel small, exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years. "I didn't ask for your help," Walter muttered, more to himself than to Jamal. The words were bitter, meant to push the boy away, to keep the fragile shell of pride intact. Jamal stared at him, stunned by the bluntness of the remark. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words got caught in his throat. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than he had expected. "Right," Jamal whispered, the hurt evident in his voice. "Well, take care." He turned quickly on his heel, walking away before the old man could see the emotion welling in his eyes. As Jamal pedaled home that evening, the wind whipped against his face, but it did little to numb the ache in his chest. He had done the right thing, he knew that, but somehow, it didn't feel like it. His mother's words rang hollow in his mind, drowned out by the sting of rejection. Later that night, over dinner, he tried to shake off the encounter, but the disappointment clung to him like a shadow. His mother noticed the change in his demeanor almost immediately. Lisa had a way of reading her son's moods, without him needing to say a word. "You okay, baby?" she asked gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. Jamal shrugged, poking at his food with little enthusiasm. "Yeah, just tired." Lisa gave him a knowing look but didn't press further. She had raised her son to be strong, to navigate the world's challenges with grace. But even the strongest hearts needed space to heal from disappointment. Jamal spent the rest of the night restless, tossing and turning in bed. Was it worth it? The thought gnawed at him, stubborn and relentless. His mother had always told him to choose kindness, even when it wasn't easy. But now, faced with the cold reality of Walter's rejection, he wasn't sure if kindness was enough. Walter, too, lay awake that night, staring at the hospital ceiling, as the weight of the day settled over him. The image of Jamal haunted him, those clear, determined eyes staring back at him, not with anger or resentment, but with concern and kindness. It made no sense. Walter had spent his entire life keeping people at a distance, building walls to protect himself from the world. But that boy, Jamal, had crossed those walls without hesitation. The thought made Walter's chest tighten, not from the remnants of the heart attack, but from something far deeper: regret. He had spent years blaming others for his misery, convincing himself that people like Jamal didn't belong in his world. But now, lying alone in the sterile hospital bed, he was forced to confront a truth he had long avoided. He was the one who had pushed the world away. For the first time in years, Walter felt something stir inside him, an unfamiliar, uncomfortable emotion that felt suspiciously like shame. The next day, as Jamal walked through the halls of his school, he carried the weight of the encounter with Walter like an invisible burden. Even his best friend Malik noticed the change in him. "You good, man?" Malik asked as they sat together in the lunchroom. Jamal shrugged, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just had a long day." He didn't tell Malik what had happened at the hospital. He didn't tell anyone. It felt too personal, too complicated to explain. How do you tell someone that you saved a life, only to be met with coldness in return? But deep down, Jamal knew the truth. He hadn't saved Walter to be thanked. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, and somehow, that had to be enough. In the quiet of the hospital room, Walter stared out the window, watching the world move on without him. For years, he had blamed the world for leaving him behind. But now, with Jamal's face lingering in his thoughts, he began to wonder, had he been the one who left the world behind? And for the first time in a long while, Walter felt the smallest flicker of a question. Could he change? Jamal tried to return to his usual rhythm, but the encounter with Walter lingered in his mind. As the days went by, he found himself replaying the moment in the hospital, the cold stare, the dismissive words, and the knot of disappointment tightening in his chest. It was not the reaction he had expected. He had saved the man's life, after all. A part of him had hoped that his actions might spark a change, if not in the world, then at least in one person. But Walter's indifference had left him questioning the value of kindness. Back at the community clinic, Jamal found it hard to focus. Normally, helping out at the clinic was the highlight of his week, a chance to feel like he was contributing to something bigger. But now, even the small victories felt hollow. He went through the motions, setting up the exam rooms, handing out supplies, but his heart wasn't in it. His mind kept drifting back to Walter, and no matter how much he tried to shake it off, the old man's bitter words clung to him like an unwanted shadow. One afternoon, while organizing medical supplies, Jamal's mentor at the clinic, Dr. Stevens, noticed the change in his demeanor. Dr. Stevens was a kind, patient man who had taken Jamal under his wing, encouraging his dreams of becoming a doctor. Seeing the usual spark missing from Jamal's eyes, he decided to intervene. "You seem distracted lately," Dr. Stevens said as they worked side by side. "Everything okay?" Jamal hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Yeah, I guess. Just dealing with some stuff." The doctor gave him a thoughtful look but didn't push further. "You know," he said after a pause, "kindness isn't always rewarded the way we expect. Sometimes it feels like a thankless job, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." Jamal nodded, though the words felt distant. He appreciated Dr. Stevens' wisdom, but he still couldn't shake the gnawing doubt in his mind. Was it really worth it to be kind when people like Walter would never change? A few more days passed, and life continued as usual. Jamal went to school, volunteered at the clinic, and helped his mother around the house. On the surface, everything seemed fine, but inside he carried the weight of Walter's rejection, a burden he couldn't quite put down. Walter, meanwhile, was grappling with a different kind of struggle. Back in his quiet, lonely house, he found himself haunted by the memory of that morning, the boy kneeling beside him, saving his life without hesitation. It made no sense to him. For years, Walter had clung to his bitterness like a shield, convinced that the world was against him. But Jamal's act of kindness had cracked that shield, leaving him exposed to an uncomfortable truth. He hadn't deserved the boy's help, and yet Jamal had helped him anyway. Walter tried to ignore the thought, burying himself in his routine. He walked Buddy every morning, read the newspaper over coffee, and watched television late into the night. But the more he tried to push the memory away, the stronger it became. It was like a stone in his shoe, small but impossible to ignore. One evening, Walter sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at the unopened bills spread out in front of him. His health insurance had covered most of the hospital costs, but there were still expenses he couldn't avoid. He should have been focused on the numbers, figuring out a way to make ends meet. But all he could think about was the boy, Jamal. Why had he done it? The question gnawed at Walter, keeping him awake at night. He knew what he had to do, though the thought of it made him uncomfortable. Apologizing wasn't something Walter did often. In fact, it was something he actively avoided. But the guilt weighed on him, growing heavier with each passing day. Finally, after much internal debate, Walter made a decision. He would go see Jamal, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to. He needed to say thank you, even if the words tasted bitter on his tongue. The next day, Walter stood at the entrance to Jamal's apartment building, Buddy's leash clutched tightly in his hand. The building was old, its brick walls weathered and cracked, but it was filled with life. Children's laughter echoed from an open window, and the scent of home-cooked meals drifted through the air. Walter felt out of place here, like a man trespassing on foreign ground. He hesitated for a moment, considering turning back, but something inside him, perhaps guilt, perhaps something else, kept him rooted to the spot. Taking a deep breath, he made his way to the front door and knocked. Jamal's mother, Lisa, answered the door, her warm smile faltering slightly when she saw the stranger standing on her doorstep. Walter shifted awkwardly, not knowing how to explain himself. Is Jamal home?" he asked, his voice gruff. Lisa studied him for a moment, then nodded. "He's in his room. Hold on." A few moments later, Jamal appeared at the door, his expression a mixture of surprise and confusion. He hadn't expected to see Walter again, let alone at his front door. Walter cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the words he needed to say. "Look, kid, I'm not good at this kind of thing," he began, his voice rough and uncertain. "But I just wanted to say thank you for what you did. You saved my life, and I owe you for that." Jamal blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected apology. For a moment he didn't know how to respond. The old man standing before him looked uncomfortable, as if the words had cost him more than he was willing to admit. "It's okay," Jamal said finally, though the words felt inadequate. Walter shifted his weight, clearly struggling with what to say next. "I know I wasn't exactly friendly back at the hospital," he continued, scratching the back of his neck. "I guess I've been carrying around a lot of stuff. But that's no excuse. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." Jamal studied the old man for a moment, trying to decide whether the apology was sincere. There was an awkwardness in Walter's posture, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. After a long pause, Jamal gave a small nod. "Thanks for saying that," he said quietly. Walter exhaled, as if relieved that the hardest part was over. He glanced down at Buddy, who wagged his tail happily, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Anyway," Walter muttered, "I'll get out of your hair. Just thanks again, kid." As Walter turned to leave, Jamal felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, confusion, and something that felt almost like hope. For the first time since the hospital, the weight on his chest seemed to lift just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Walter walked away, Buddy trotting faithfully at his side. He wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the faint stirrings of change. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to rewrite the story he had been telling himself for years. And Jamal, standing in the doorway of his apartment, watched him go, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe kindness wasn't about who deserved it. Maybe kindness was about planting seeds, even if you never got to see them grow. Both of them, in their own way, had taken a step forward. And though neither knew what lay ahead, they had begun to understand that sometimes change begins with the smallest of gestures. It was only the beginning, but it was enough. A week passed, and life seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. Jamal kept himself busy with schoolwork, shifts at the clinic, and time spent with his friends, but the encounter with Walter stayed in the back of his mind. He hadn't told anyone about the old man's visit, not even his mother. Something about it felt too personal, too raw, as if sharing it would strip it of its significance. Yet, for all his attempts to move on, Jamal couldn't help but feel that the moment with Walter wasn't the end of their strange connection. There was a sense, vague but persistent, that something had shifted, though he couldn't say what. Then, one Saturday morning, while Jamal was helping his mom with laundry, there was a knock at the door. Lisa, folding clothes on the living room couch, glanced at Jamal. "Can you get that, baby?" she asked, not looking up from the pile of towels. Jamal wiped his hands on his pants and walked to the door, opening it without much thought. His breath hitched slightly when he saw who was standing on the other side. Walter stood there, looking just as out of place as he had the first time, though now there was something different about him. He wasn't wearing the same guarded expression. Instead, his face carried a quiet awkwardness, as if he were bracing himself for something uncomfortable. In his hand was a small lumpy paper bag, crumpled around the edges. Hey," Walter said, his voice gruff but lacking its usual sharpness. "I brought these." He held up the bag awkwardly. Jamal blinked, unsure how to respond. "What is it?" "Cookies," Walter muttered, shoving the bag forward. "Thought you might like them. They're store-bought, so don't get your hopes up." Jamal stared at the bag for a moment, caught between confusion and amusement. It wasn't every day that the man whose life you saved, and who later insulted you, showed up at your door with cookies. "Oh, thanks," Jamal said, taking the bag from him. He stepped aside, feeling an odd sense of responsibility to at least be polite. "Do you want to come in?" Walter hesitated, shifting on his feet. "Sure, I guess." Lisa, curious about who was at the door, glanced over and saw the unfamiliar older man stepping into their living room. She set the laundry aside, her brow furrowing slightly, but she greeted him with her usual warmth. "Hello there," she said with a friendly smile. "I'm Lisa. You must be Mr. Collins?" Walter nodded stiffly. "Yeah, call me Walter." Jamal shot his mom a glance, and she gave him a subtle nod, the unspoken communication between them clear. Be polite, even if it feels awkward. "Have a seat," Lisa offered, motioning to the worn couch. Walter sat down slowly, as if unsure whether the furniture would hold his weight. Buddy, his old Labrador, waited patiently at his feet, wagging his tail slightly as if to say, "I come in peace." For a moment, the room was silent. Walter looked around, clearly out of his element. The apartment was small and cluttered, but it was filled with life, photos on the walls, half-read books on the coffee table, and the faint smell of cinnamon lingering in the air. It was a far cry from the neat, sterile order of his own house, and the contrast made him feel oddly exposed. "I wanted to stop by and, say thanks again," Walter said after a long pause. His voice was awkward, like someone trying to speak a language they hadn't used in years. "I know I didn't exactly make things easy the first time." Jamal gave a small shrug. "It's okay." "No, it's not," Walter muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm not good at this kind of thing. But the truth is, you didn't have to help me. You could have just left me there, and I guess I've been trying to figure out why you didn't." Jamal hesitated. How could he explain the lessons his mom had drilled into him for years? The ones about kindness and doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. How could he put into words the way he had felt, standing over Walter that morning, knowing he had the power to walk away but choosing not to? "It just felt like the right thing to do," Jamal said quietly. Walter nodded, as if the answer both satisfied and unsettled him. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm grateful." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Lisa, sensing the tension, stood up and clapped her hands lightly. "How about some coffee?" she offered. "Or tea, if you prefer." "Coffee's fine," Walter replied. As Lisa disappeared into the kitchen, the two sat in silence, the only sound the gentle thump of Buddy's tail against the floor. Jamal shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of the quiet between them. "I don't really know how to explain it," Walter said suddenly, breaking the silence. "But after what you did, I guess I've been thinking a lot about things, about the way I've lived my life, and well, I don't like what I see." Jamal glanced at him, surprised by the admission. "I've spent a long time being angry at the world," Walter continued, his gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. "Blaming people for things that weren't really their fault. Maybe it was easier that way. But the truth is, I don't even know how I got here. How I ended up so bitter." Jamal listened quietly, unsure what to say. It was strange hearing someone like Walter talk about regret. It was even stranger to realize that, despite everything, Walter seemed sincere. "I guess what I'm trying to say," Walter added, "is that I want to try and do better. I don't know how yet, but I want to start somewhere." Jamal nodded slowly. "That's a good place to start." The conversation wasn't perfect. It was awkward and halting, filled with pauses that stretched a little too long, but it was real, and for the first time both of them felt like they were moving towards something small but important. Lisa returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting them down on the table. Walter accepted his with a quiet, "thank you," his hands wrapping around the warm mug as if it were an anchor. As they sipped their coffee in silence, a subtle shift settled over the room. It wasn't a grand moment, and there were no dramatic speeches or sudden revelations, but it was enough. Sometimes change begins not with bold declarations, but with the simple act of showing up. And in that small, cluttered apartment, surrounded by mismatched furniture and the faint hum of life, 2 people, so different, yet connected by a strange twist of fate, took the first steps toward understanding each other. Neither knew where the road would lead, but for the first time, both of them felt that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone in the world as they had once thought. Over the next few weeks, Walter made an effort to keep showing up, slowly breaking through the invisible barriers he had built over the years. At first, the gestures were small. He stopped by the apartment once or twice a week, always with Buddy at his side, bringing small gifts, a pack of gum, a book he thought Jamal might like, or more cookies, always store-bought and a little stale. Each visit carried the awkwardness of someone trying to learn a new language, but Jamal accepted them with quiet grace, sensing that Walter's efforts, however clumsy, were genuine. Jamal's mother, Lisa, encouraged the budding connection. She invited Walter to join them for meals whenever he stopped by, subtly easing the tension that still lingered between them. At first, their conversations were stiff, filled with polite small talk and awkward silences. But gradually, as the visits became more frequent, the walls began to come down. Walter, for the first time in years, found himself curious about someone else's life. He asked Jamal questions about school, about his volunteer work at the clinic, and about his dream of becoming a doctor. At first, the questions felt forced, as if he were following some invisible script. But as Jamal shared more about himself, his struggles, his hopes, and the challenges of growing up in a world that often seemed to judge him before knowing him, Walter found himself genuinely interested. Jamal, too, began to open up. At first, it was out of politeness, a way of responding to Walter's efforts without much thought. But as the old man kept showing up, week after week, something shifted. Jamal started to see the cracks beneath Walter's gruff exterior, the loneliness, the regrets, and the faint flicker of hope that perhaps it wasn't too late to change. One Saturday afternoon, Walter invited Jamal to join him and Buddy for a walk in the park. It was a strange offer, and Jamal hesitated at first, unsure what to make of it. But something in Walter's expression, an unspoken plea maybe, convinced him to say yes. They walked together along the winding paths, Buddy trotting happily between them. The sun was warm on their backs, and the breeze carried the faint scent of blooming flowers. For the first few minutes, they walked in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But gradually, the conversation began to flow, easy and unforced. Walter shared stories from his past, about his time in the military, about his late wife, and about the children he rarely saw. There was a sadness in his voice as he spoke of the distance that had grown between him and his kids, a distance he now realized had been partly his fault. "I guess I wasn't the easiest person to be around," Walter admitted, his voice low. "I was always too busy being angry at the world to see what I had right in front of me." Jamal listened quietly, sensing the weight of Walter's words. It was strange, hearing the old man talk so openly about his regrets, but it also felt good. Like a bridge was slowly being built between them, one story at a time. As they circled the park, Jamal found himself sharing more too. He talked about the challenges of school, about the pressure to succeed, and about the subtle, everyday moments of racism he encountered, things that were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. "It's not always the big stuff," Jamal explained. "It's the little things, like how people look at you different when you walk into a store, or how teachers assume you're not as smart just because of how you look." Walter nodded, his brow furrowing in thought. "I never really thought about it that way," he admitted. "I guess I've been guilty of that too." Jamal gave a small shrug. "Most people are. They just don't realize it." Walter fell silent, digesting Jamal's words. It was a lot to take in, but he was grateful for the honesty. It wasn't easy, facing the uncomfortable truths about himself. But if there was one thing he had learned since that morning in the park, it was that growth often came with discomfort. Over time, their walks became a regular routine. Every Saturday, they met at the park, walking buddy along the familiar paths and talking about everything and nothing. The conversations ranged from lighthearted banter about sports and movies to deeper discussions about life, regret, and the things that truly mattered. The change in Walter didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors who had grown used to his cold demeanor were surprised to see him walking with Jamal, chatting easily with the boy he once would have scowled at. Some gave him strange looks, clearly unsure what to make of the unexpected friendship. But Walter didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a connection to the world beyond his own front door. The park became a place where both of them could leave their burdens behind, even if only for a little while. Jamal, who had always carried the weight of expectations and prejudice, found solace in the quiet companionship of an old man and his dog. And Walter, who had spent so many years closed off from the world, discovered that it was never too late to open his heart. Their friendship wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments when old habits threatened to creep back in. But each time those moments arose, they pushed through them, learning, growing, and finding new ways to understand each other. And in those quiet, unremarkable moments, walking through the park, laughing over shared stories, and simply being there for each other, they began to realize that sometimes the most profound connections are the ones you never see coming. The bond between Jamal and Walter continued to grow in the following weeks, shifting from something tentative into a genuine friendship. Their conversations deepened with each meeting, revealing vulnerabilities neither had shared with anyone else in a long time. Jamal found comfort in Walter's presence, a quiet kind of mentorship that felt more valuable than anything he had expected. Walter, for his part, felt as though he had been given a second chance at life, one that came not through grand gestures, but through the small kindnesses of a boy who had every reason to turn his back on him. But life, as it often does, had a way of testing the strength of newfound connections. That test arrived one rainy afternoon, when Jamal and Walter found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. It started like any other Saturday. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle had settled over the park, but that didn't stop them from meeting for their usual walk. They strolled along the damp paths, Buddy splashing happily in puddles while Jamal and Walter talked about school and sports. They had just reached the far edge of the park when the atmosphere shifted. A black SUV, its windows tinted, rolled slowly down the narrow street beside them. Something about the way it moved, silent, deliberate, set Jamal on edge. Walter noticed it too. His hand tightened instinctively on Buddy's leash, his gaze narrowing as the vehicle came to a stop a few yards ahead. The doors swung open, and two men stepped out, both wearing dark hoodies, their faces hidden beneath the shadows of the hoods. Jamal's heart raced. He had grown up knowing the subtle signs of danger, body language, movements, unspoken tension. These men weren't here by accident. One of them glanced around the empty street, his hand slipping into his pocket. Walter's jaw clenched as he saw the glint of something metallic, a weapon. Jamal reacted without thinking. "We need to go," he whispered urgently, grabbing Walter's arm. But the men were already moving toward them, their strides purposeful and menacing. "Hey!" one of them called out, his voice sharp and aggressive. "What's in the bag, old man?" Walter glanced down at the canvas tote slung over his shoulder. Inside were nothing but a few books and some snacks for their walk. But it didn't matter. This wasn't about what was in the bag. It was about intimidation and control. Before Walter could respond, the second man stepped forward, pulling a small knife from his pocket. "Hand it over," he growled. Walter stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Fear gripped him in a way he hadn't felt in years, but beside him, Jamal's mind raced. He knew that if things escalated, someone could get seriously hurt. "Just give them the bag," Jamal said quietly, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's not worth it." Walter hesitated, his pride warring with his common sense. But Jamal's steady gaze anchored him, reminding him that this wasn't about ego, it was about survival. Reluctantly, Walter held out the bag. "Take it," he muttered. One of the men snatched it from his hand with a sneer, rifling through the contents with disinterest. Finding nothing of value, he tossed the bag to the ground with a grunt of frustration. But it wasn't enough to walk away empty-handed. The man with the knife stepped closer, his gaze dark with malice. "What else you got, old man?" Jamal saw the shift in the man's posture, the slight tension in his grip on the knife. He knew they weren't going to leave without causing trouble. And that's when something unexpected happened. Walter, who had spent so much of his life avoiding conflict, stepped in front of Jamal, his body shielding the boy from the looming threat. "You've got what you wanted," Walter said, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. "Now leave us alone." The man with the knife sneered, clearly amused by the old man's bravado. "Or what?" he taunted, stepping closer. Jamal felt his stomach twist in fear. "Walter, don't—" But Walter didn't back down. He stood firm, his gaze locked on the man before him. Years of bitterness, regret, and isolation had weighed him down for too long, but in this moment, all of that fell away. All that mattered was protecting the boy who had saved his life, whether he deserved it or not. "You're not touching the kid," Walter said, his voice low and unyielding. "Not today." The tension in the air crackled, thick and suffocating. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the man with the knife might strike, but then a sharp whistle echoed through the air. Both men turned toward the sound, their expressions shifting from aggression to caution. Down the street, the distant wail of police sirens grew louder, cutting through the rainy afternoon like a warning. "Let's go," one of the men muttered, pulling his companion back toward the SUV. They climbed into the vehicle and sped off, just as the first police car rounded the corner, its lights flashing in the rain. Jamal exhaled, his body sagging with relief as the danger evaporated. Walter stood frozen for a moment longer, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. "You didn't have to do that," Jamal said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Walter turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I did," he replied simply. The police officers arrived moments later, asking questions and taking statements. Jamal and Walter explained what had happened, though there wasn't much to tell. The officers promised to patrol the area more frequently and gave the two of them a ride back to the apartment. As they sat in the back of the police car, Jamal glanced at Walter, a new sense of respect blooming in his chest. He had seen a side of the old man he hadn't expected, a side that wasn't defined by bitterness or regret, but by courage and loyalty. Walter, for his part, sat quietly beside Jamal, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not the false, defensive kind he had clung to for so many years, but something real and grounding. For the first time, he had acted not out of anger or fear, but out of love. Love for a boy who had shown him a better way to live. The rain continued to fall as the police car made its way through the quiet streets, the wipers thumping rhythmically against the windshield, and in the silence between them, both Jamal and Walter knew that something profound had shifted. They had faced fear together and come out on the other side, not as strangers bound by obligation, but as friends, partners in a world that was slowly, steadily, becoming a little brighter. Walter could still feel the adrenaline coursing through him long after they were dropped off at Jamal's apartment. He stood in the doorway, rainwater dripping from the brim of his cap, while Buddy shook himself dry beside him. The two police officers gave them a polite nod before driving off into the misty streets, leaving Walter and Jamal in the quiet aftermath of the encounter. Inside, Lisa greeted them with concern, her warm brown eyes scanning their faces for any sign of injury. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tinged with both worry and relief. "We ran into a little trouble at the park," Walter said, trying to downplay the event. "But we're fine." Jamal gave his mother a reassuring nod. "It's okay, Mom. Walter, well, he kind of saved me today." The words surprised both of them, Jamal for saying them out loud, and Walter for hearing them. The old man had spent so much of his life believing that he was incapable of change, that he had nothing left to offer the world. Yet here was Jamal, looking at him with something close to admiration, saying the words Walter had never imagined would apply to him. He saved someone. Lisa's gaze softened as she looked at Walter, understanding passing between them without words. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. Walter shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise. "It's nothing," he mumbled, glancing away. "Just doing what I had to." Jamal knew better. He had seen the way Walter had stood between him and the men with the knife, fearless despite his age, despite the danger. It wasn't nothing, it was everything. After a brief conversation, Walter made his way toward the door, Buddy padding along beside him. "I should get going," he said, pulling on his damp coat. Jamal walked him to the door, the cool evening air rushing in as Walter opened it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jamal cleared his throat. "Thanks for today," he said. "For real." Walter gave a small nod, his expression softening. "Anytime, kid." As Walter stepped out into the rain, Jamal watched him go, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. He knew, without a doubt, that their connection had become something more than a passing bond. Walter wasn't just a man he had saved in the park that day. He was someone who mattered now, someone who had made a difference in Jamal's life, too. Back at home, Walter sat in his worn recliner, Buddy curled up at his feet. The house was quiet, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt peaceful. He thought about the events of the day, about the fear he had felt when those men had approached them. But more than that, he thought about the way he had stepped in without hesitation, not to prove anything to himself or the world, but simply because it was the right thing to do. The realization settled over him like a warm blanket. He had changed. He had spent so much of his life running from that possibility, convinced that change was impossible, that he was too old, too set in his ways. But now, sitting in his quiet living room with Buddy snoring softly at his feet, Walter knew that change was not only possible, it was happening, slowly but surely, every time he chose to show up, every time he reached beyond the walls he had built around himself. In the days that followed, Walter began making other small changes. He called his daughter for the first time in months, leaving a halting message on her voicemail. He apologized to the neighbor he had once snapped at over a parking space. He even started attending the community meetings that he had long avoided, sitting quietly in the back and listening to the discussions about how to improve the neighborhood. It wasn't easy. Every step felt like a struggle, like swimming upstream against a lifetime of habits. But with each small act, Walter felt something shift inside him, a lightness he hadn't known in years, as if the bitterness that had weighed him down was slowly evaporating, replaced by something new. Jamal noticed the change, too. Their walks became less about obligation and more about companionship, two people sharing the simple joys of a conversation, a dog's wagging tail, or a warm afternoon in the park. Walter's sharp edges softened, and in their place emerged a man who was learning, day by day, how to be open to the world again. One afternoon, as they sat together on a bench overlooking the park, Jamal turned to Walter with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wish you'd done things differently?" he asked, his voice quiet. Walter leaned back, watching the sunlight dance through the leaves. "All the time," he admitted. "I've got more regrets than I know what to do with." Jamal nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "But you're doing better now," he said. "That counts for something, right?" Walter smiled, a genuine unguarded smile that felt strange and wonderful on his face. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think it does." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Buddy chase squirrels through the grass. In that moment, it didn't matter where they had come from or how different their lives had been. All that mattered was the connection they had built, a friendship that, against all odds, had grown into something strong and real. Walter knew that he still had a long way to go. There would be moments of doubt, moments when the old bitterness threatened to creep back in, but he also knew that he didn't have to face those moments alone. He had Jamal now, a friend, a mentor, and a reminder that it was never too late to choose a different path. And for Jamal, the friendship with Walter had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the most unlikely connections could change the world, one small act of kindness at a time. The seasons began to shift, with winter giving way to the first signs of spring. The days grew longer, and the park, which had become their meeting place, came alive with blooming flowers and children playing on the grass. Life moved forward in its quiet, steady rhythm. But for both Jamal and Walter, those weeks had been anything but ordinary. They had been transformative. Walter continued to show up, not just for Jamal but also for himself. He attended community events, took part in small volunteer projects, and reconnected with his estranged daughter. She had been surprised, suspicious even, when he reached out, but over time, her walls began to crumble. Their conversations were awkward at first, filled with years of unspoken hurt, but slowly, they began to bridge the distance that had grown between them. Jamal saw the changes in Walter, not just in his actions, but in his demeanor. The old man's sharp edges had softened, and there was a kindness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as though Walter had discovered something within himself, a capacity for love, for connection, that he had buried under years of anger and regret. One Saturday, the two of them sat together at a community event held at the park. It was a simple affair. Families gathered under the open sky, children running through the grass, and the smell of barbecue wafting through the air. Walter and Jamal sat side by side on a picnic bench, Buddy dozing contentedly at their feet. At one point, a local organizer approached them, microphone in hand. She was a friendly woman who had taken notice of Walter's recent involvement in the community. Smiling warmly, she invited him to say a few words to the gathered crowd. Walter hesitated, caught off guard. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and the thought of standing in front of so many people made his palms sweat. But then he glanced at Jamal, who gave him an encouraging nod. That small gesture was all the reassurance he needed. Walter rose slowly, the microphone trembling slightly in his hand. The crowd quieted, their curious eyes fixed on the man who, not long ago, had been little more than a grumpy recluse. Walter cleared his throat and began to speak. "I'm not one for speeches," he started, his voice rough but steady. "But I guess I've got something to say today." He paused, searching for the right words. "A few months ago, I wasn't a good man. I was angry, at the world, at people I didn't know, at myself. I spent most of my life building walls, thinking they'd keep me safe, but all they did was make me lonely." Walter glanced at Jamal, who listened intently. "Then one day something happened that I didn't expect. I had a heart attack, and if things had gone the way I thought they would, I wouldn't be standing here today. But this kid," he gestured toward Jamal, "this kid saved my life." The crowd murmured in surprise, a ripple of curiosity spreading through the gathering. He didn't know me, and he sure didn't have any reason to help me, but he did it anyway. Walter's voice faltered slightly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "He showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it, and because of that, I got a second chance." Walter looked out at the crowd, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's never too late. It's never too late to change, to make things right, to be better." The crowd was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. Then, slowly, they began to clap. The applause started softly, but it grew, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Walter stood there, humbled and grateful, as the people around him celebrated his transformation. When he returned to the bench, Jamal was smiling. "That was pretty good," the boy said, a hint of teasing in his voice. Walter chuckled, the sound light and genuine. "Not bad for an old man, huh?" They sat together as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park. In that moment, there were no barriers between them, no age, no race, no regrets, just two friends who had found their way to each other against all odds. As the event wound down and families began to disperse, Jamal turned to Walter. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think my mom was right. Kindness really does make a difference." Walter smiled, the lines on his face softening. "Yeah," he agreed quietly. "It sure does." And in that moment, under the fading light of the setting sun, they both knew that what they had found was something rare and precious, a friendship built not on convenience or circumstance, but on compassion, forgiveness, and the belief that it's never too late to change. In the weeks following Walter's speech, the bond between him and Jamal continued to grow stronger. What had begun as an awkward connection, born out of an act of unexpected kindness, had evolved into a friendship that neither of them could have predicted. Their routine walks through the park remained a cherished part of their week, but something deeper had started to take root. Walter had become more than just a friend to Jamal. He had become a mentor, someone who understood the weight of regret and the power of change. Walter, for his part, was learning how to live again. The walls he had spent years building, those heavy barriers of resentment and fear, were slowly being dismantled, brick by brick. He found himself doing things he never thought he'd do. He began volunteering at the local community center, helping with gardening projects and handing out meals to those in need. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel connected to the world in ways he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, after a particularly busy day at the center, Walter sat with Jamal on their usual park bench, sipping from a thermos of coffee. The sun was bright, and children's laughter echoed through the park, a sound that once would have annoyed Walter but now felt oddly comforting. "You know," Walter began, his voice thoughtful, "I spent so many years thinking it was too late for me, too late to change, too late to make amends." He glanced at Jamal, the boy's young face full of quiet wisdom beyond his years. "But I was wrong. It's never too late, is it?" Jamal smiled. "Nope," he said. "It's never too late." The simplicity of the statement struck Walter. He had spent so much of his life believing that change was out of reach, that the mistakes of his past were too heavy to overcome. But Jamal had shown him, through quiet actions rather than grand gestures, that redemption was possible, no matter how far down the wrong path you had gone. Later that evening, back in the quiet of his home, Walter sat at his kitchen table, a pen and a blank piece of paper in front of him. For a long time he stared at the empty page, unsure of where to begin. The paper wasn't just a surface. It was a chance to write the words he had been too afraid to say. Finally, with a deep breath, he began to write. "Dear Emily, it's been too long. I know I haven't been the father you needed, and for that, I am sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be better." Walter paused, the pen hovering over the page. There was so much he wanted to say, so many years of silence to make up for. But for now, this was enough. He finished the letter, folded it carefully, and slid it into an envelope. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a step, a small, tentative step toward healing the broken relationship with his daughter. The following Saturday, Jamal invited Walter to his house for dinner. Lisa had cooked a hearty meal, filling the apartment with the warm, inviting smells of spices and roasted vegetables. Walter sat at the table, watching as Jamal set the plates with practiced ease. It was a scene that felt both foreign and familiar, a reminder of the family dinners he had once taken for granted. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and shared stories. Walter felt a strange warmth settle over him, not just from the food, but from the sense of belonging that came with being part of something again. At one point, as they cleared the dishes, Lisa turned to Walter with a smile. "You know," she said, "you're welcome here anytime. You're family now." The words caught Walter off guard. Family. It had been so long since he had felt like he belonged anywhere, let alone in someone's home. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." Jamal smiled at him from across the room, and in that moment, Walter realized just how far he had come. He had started this journey as a bitter, isolated man, convinced that the world had nothing left to offer him. But now, sitting at a table surrounded by warmth and acceptance, he knew the truth. Life had given him a second chance. Over time, Walter became a fixture in Jamal's life, attending his school events, cheering him on at basketball games, and even helping him study for exams. The transformation was slow and subtle, but it was there, shaping both their lives in ways they hadn't expected. Walter had found purpose again, and Jamal had gained not just a mentor, but a friend who, against all odds, had shown him the value of hope and the power of forgiveness. The community began to take notice of Walter's change as well. The man who had once been known for his scowls and complaints was now greeted with smiles and waves as he walked through the neighborhood with Buddy by his side. It was a small but meaningful shift, a reminder that even the most unlikely people could change the world around them, one small act at a time. And through it all, Walter knew that none of this would have been possible without Jamal. The boy's kindness, offered without expectation, without judgment, had opened a door that Walter hadn't even known was there. One day, as they walked together through the park, Walter turned to Jamal and said, "You know, kid, you saved my life in more ways than one." Jamal grinned, a playful glint in his eye. "I know," he said, his voice light with humor. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "Smart Alec." They walked on in comfortable silence, the sound of Buddy's paws pattering against the pavement, and as they strolled beneath the canopy of blossoming trees, both of them knew that what they had found was something rare, something that transcended age, race, and circumstance. It was the kind of friendship that changed lives, and it was a reminder to both of them that it was never too late to choose kindness, never too late to change. It was a cool autumn afternoon when Jamal and Walter found themselves walking through the park once again. Buddy trotted along happily, oblivious to the heaviness hanging in the air. Their conversation was light at first, touching on sports and Jamal's upcoming exams. But as they rounded a bend near the edge of the park, a chill of unease settled over them. Jamal saw them first, the two men from the robbery. They were standing near a bench, their dark hoodies pulled up, talking to a local shopkeeper named Mr. Peterson, who owned a small convenience store down the street. Mr. Peterson was a kind man, someone Jamal knew well. He often gave free snacks to neighborhood kids who couldn't afford them. Jamal's stomach dropped. There was something off about the way the two men stood, their postures tense, their words sharp. Peterson's face was tight with worry, his hands raised in a placating gesture as if trying to diffuse a situation that had already spiraled out of control. Walter noticed it too. His hand instinctively tightened on Buddy's leash, and a familiar knot of dread twisted in his gut. "Let's go," he muttered to Jamal. "We don't want trouble." But before they could turn away, the argument escalated. One of the men shoved Mr. Peterson, sending him stumbling back against the bench. The other pulled a knife from his pocket, the blade glinting dangerously in the afternoon light. Jamal froze, his heart racing. "We have to do something," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. Walter grabbed his arm. "No, Jamal, we can't." But it was too late. The man with the knife lunged forward, plunging the blade into Mr. Peterson's chest. The shopkeeper let out a choked gasp, collapsing to the ground, as the two men fled, sprinting toward a black SUV parked nearby. Jamal stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. The sound of the SUV's engine roared in the distance as the vehicle sped away, leaving behind the chilling silence of what had just happened. Walter reacted first, rushing toward Peterson's fallen body. Jamal followed, dropping to his knees beside the man. Blood seeped through Peterson's shirt, staining the ground beneath him. His breathing was shallow, each gasp weaker than the last. Walter pressed his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with us, Peterson," he urged, his voice steady despite the panic surging through him. "Help is on the way." Jamal fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. The operator's voice on the other end was calm, but Jamal's heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. "We need an ambulance," he stammered. "He's been stabbed. Please hurry." The ambulance arrived within minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The paramedics worked quickly, loading Mr. Peterson onto a stretcher and rushing him to the hospital. Walter and Jamal stood in stunned silence, watching the ambulance disappear down the street. Jamal felt numb, his mind replaying the moment over and over, the flash of the knife, the gasp of pain, the sight of Peterson crumpling to the ground. He had seen violence before, but this felt different. This felt personal. Walter placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, his voice low. "Come on, kid, let's get out of here." They walked back to the apartment in silence, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on them like a heavy fog. Inside, Lisa took one look at their pale faces and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Jamal sat down heavily on the couch, his hands trembling. "They killed him, Mom," he whispered. "The guys from the park. They killed Mr. Peterson." Lisa's breath caught, and she sank into a chair, her hand covering her mouth. Walter stood nearby, his expression grim. The next few days were a blur. The police questioned Jamal and Walter, taking their statements and promising to investigate. The news of Mr. Peterson's murder spread quickly through the community, leaving everyone shaken and afraid. For Jamal, the tragedy hit hard. He had always believed in kindness, in doing the right thing. But now, in the face of senseless violence, those beliefs felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. Walter noticed the change in him, the way Jamal withdrew, his usual brightness dimmed by anger and grief. Walter knew that feeling all too well. It was the same darkness that had consumed him for years, the same bitterness that had nearly destroyed him. Jamal stood on the edge, tempted by thoughts of revenge. He knew the names of the men who had killed Mr. Peterson. It would be easy to find them, easy to confront them. The idea gnawed at him, pulling him toward a path he knew he shouldn't take. Walter saw it coming. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Walter turned to Jamal, his expression serious. "Don't do it, kid," he said quietly. Jamal looked at him, his eyes filled with frustration and pain. "Why not? They deserve it. They killed him, and they'll just keep hurting people." Walter shook his head. "I know how it feels. I've been where you are, but revenge won't bring him back. It won't fix anything." Jamal clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "So what do we do? Just let them get away with it?" "No," Walter said firmly. "We hold them accountable. We do it the right way." He met Jamal's gaze, his voice steady. "We go to the police. We tell the truth, and we make sure they face justice." Jamal stared at him, the conflict raging in his heart. But slowly, the anger began to fade, replaced by something else. Trust. Trust in the man who had once been a stranger, but who had become a friend. The police acted swiftly, arresting the two men responsible for Mr. Peterson's murder. The community came together to mourn the loss of a kind and generous man, and at the memorial, Walter stood before the crowd once again. This time, his words carried even more weight. "We can't undo what's been done," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But we can honor Peterson by choosing to be better, by choosing kindness, even when it's hard, even when it hurts." Jamal stood beside him, listening quietly. The pain of Peterson's loss was still fresh, but in Walter's words, he found a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, kindness mattered. As they left the memorial, Walter and Jamal walked side by side, the bond between them stronger than ever. They had faced fear, anger, and loss together, and in the end, they had chosen a path of hope and redemption. It wasn't the ending they had wanted, but it was the one they had chosen, and that, in itself, was enough.